This is, if you were the perfect person, you would have all of these characteristics and all of these qualities. I don't have all of them. There's several of areas I really have to work at. But the whole idea is that if we're going to become our best, we need something like this, a checklist that says this is what you're aiming for. And you can look at it and you can sort of fudge and say, oh, that's me, I can do that. Or you can be honest and say, I really need to work on that area. And that's the whole idea behind this, is not to make you feel bad or say, because sometimes I go to these things and they start talking about what you ought to be doing, and I say, Lord, I'm the worst children's guy that's ever been. I don't do none of that stuff. And I don't want you to feel that way. I want this to be something that you look at and you say, this is the area I really need to work at. I got this one down pretty decent, and make it that way. But I came up with 15 characteristics. Now you could probably come up with a whole bunch more things that you could do as a children's ministry leader. But we'll just jump in and get started. Number one, they're living for the eternal. They're living for the eternal. I'll spell it for you, E-T-E-N-R-A-L. Now there's two things I mean by that. Number one, it's a fancy way of saying they know that they're saved. Now I know we assume everybody that volunteers to help in the church is saved, but that's not always true. My wife and I had been married over a year, and I was in the bus ministry. We were in Rome, Georgia, at the church there. And I was getting up Saturday morning, getting ready to go to bus visitation. I came out of the bathroom and she was sitting up in the bed, and I thought she was sick. I mean, she just was quiet as she could be. And I said, honey, what's wrong? She said, Larry, I don't think I'm saved. Now, you talk about knocking somebody over, man. I mean, this was my wife. We had prayed when we were dating. We had gone soul winning together. If anybody was saved, it was my wife. And she said, I don't think I've ever been saved. She said, God's just really been dealing with me. And last night I dreamed the Lord came back and we were standing in the front yard and you went up to be with him and I stayed. And she said, I've been up all night trying to figure that out. And she never made a decision. When she was in the 4th grade, she came down to the front of her church and they said, Kathy, we're so happy for you. Fill out this card. And they called her parents and said, we're going to baptize Kathy this Sunday night. And they said, okay. And that was it. Nobody ever asked her if she had ever sinned. Nobody ever asked her any of that. And so the next morning, in front of 400 folks, she came down out of the choir and presented herself for baptism in front of all those folks. And the Sunday night, I baptized her. I got to baptize my wife and all 3 of my kids, and I hope to do some of my grandkids before the Lord takes me home. But folks asked us, well, how does a staff member's wife get saved? The same way anybody else gets saved.
Amen.
And they said, well, what do they think? Well, the people that were saved rejoiced with us. And people that aren't, doesn't matter,
Right.
And so if you're here and you've had a doubt about that or anything, settle that and make sure. And don't worry about anything else, because it's all going to work out. The most important thing is that you know, because you can't sell what you don't have. And you'll be a whole bunch better teacher if you ever get saved. I mean, maybe a whole bunch. You think you're good now, just wait. And then living for the eternal doesn't mean just that you're saved, but it also means that you realize what you're doing today has eternal consequences. You don't see a lot of results from children's ministry because kids change slowly. Even when they get saved, most of them don't have big behavior changes. I've had some kids, Lord, that's what they've been needing for a long time, because they just had total personality changes and became different kids. But most of them don't. But we have to realize that we're doing this for years from now. We're planting a foundation. We're building a wall. I sort of see it like this. I see it that every time a kid comes to church, it's like putting a brick on the brick wall. And you start with just down here, and you put a brick up, and they come to Sunday school, and they come to the next thing, and you put a brick, and you come to church a whole bunch of times, and that's not too big. But hopefully, that kid's going to stay in church, and over time, that wall is going to become pretty big and pretty strong. And that's what you want. You want to have that going so that when they hit those teenage years and when they become adults, we've already got a pretty good solid thing going there. Because Satan's going to beat them to death if he can, because he does all of us that way. And so we want to make sure that foundation is strong, the wall is strong, and that it can withstand the attacks of Satan. So it's for the eternal. It's not just for right now. Then they are backstage leaders. They are backstage leaders. Now, how do we take care of being a backstage leader? Well, I came up with 3 things that you can do, because most of us aren't comfortable with being out front. Most of us are happy doing whatever it is that we're doing right now. Every now and then I run across somebody that wants to be the band leader in their church, and they bother the hound out of me, to be honest, because they come up and bug me all the time. And you realize, boy, they're just trying to be number one. But most of folks that I deal with, they aren't like that. They're just very quiet. They're doing their thing. And so you become a backstage leader by walking with God. Walk with God is that first one. You can do a lot of things in church and not be walking with God, but children's ministry is not one of them. I tell you, it's too discouraging. You pour your heart out and the kids aren't listening. They don't seem like you're getting through. You're sitting there and you go home wondering, do they get anything out of what I do on Sunday morning? And we've all been there. We all say, good night, man. I can pass out bulletins and have more effect than this, But we realize that when we're walking with God, we just realize that's the way things are. And we walk with God by doing what? By praying, by reading our Bible, by making sure that we're in church, and doing all of those things that we need to do to walk with God and to be spiritual. Because if not, man, discouragement can come too easy, and it'll happen. Then you have to guard your heart. The Bible says out of the heart are the issues of life. And that means we have to be careful what we desire after and what our heart longs for. And that means we have to be careful. Because if we're not, we will wind up deciding we like something else a whole lot better than we like what we're doing on Sunday morning. And that's when something else gets a hold to our heart. And I have to watch that person. I'm a big Alabama fan. In fact, I told Charity, she said that you're going to be staying with these folks, and I said, that's fine with me, but I tell you, Saturday night I'm going to watch the LSU-Alabama game. If I have to go to a bar, I'm going to watch it. I had some friends of mine that came up to see me today, and they invited me to come. But anyway, if I'm not careful, that will become a big part of my life. And so I really guard my heart to make sure that those kind of things, there's nothing wrong with them. I mean, there's not anything wrong with being an Alabama fan. Anybody with any sense is. but it's wrong when it has your heart. And it's wrong when that becomes more important than the things of God to you, and you have to guard your heart. And then run from sin. Run from sin. There's not a one of us that could, under the right set of circumstances, couldn't do any sin there is. Under the right set of circumstances. And we have to guard against that, because it's really easy to say, oh man, I've been in church all these years and I've never done that. And that's just about the time you're going to get in trouble. When you think that you're not going to get in trouble, that's when Satan says you're on a bet. I'll do my best to get you in trouble. So when you recognize something, this is wrong, you get out of there as quick as you can, because you have to do that. And then number 3, they bear fruit. They bear fruit. Now that can be that they win people to the Lord, and boy, if you can't get kids saved, you can't get anybody saved. We're going to talk about that, I think probably on Sunday night in the sermon, about what Jesus had to say about getting kids saved, and why it's such a vital thing, and why it's easy to do. But they bear fruit. They bear fruit by seeing people come to know Christ. They bear fruit by seeing kids grow spiritually and develop in their lives the fruits of the Spirit. And they're fruit-bearing Christians. Then they protect the unity of the church. They protect the unity of the church. Boy, red flags go off. I travel all the time. Last week I was in North Carolina. This week I'm here, and next week I'll be in Alabama, and then I'm off for 6 or 7 weeks. And I enjoy doing that. But when I go into a church and somebody starts telling me what's wrong with their pastor, or the problem they're having with so-and-so over here, man, there's a problem there. And it's not with the people this person's talking about. It's with that person. Yeah. It's important that we make sure that we're not the ones that cause any kind of division in the church. Right. And if you got a problem with anybody, the Bible says you go to that person and one-on-one you say, I don't like whatever it is that you're doing. And you two work it out. And if that doesn't work, then you go get a couple of friends and you go to them. And if that doesn't work, then you get the whole bunch in on it, because God doesn't want us to be anybody that creates any problems in the church. And I know none of you would, but you may run across somebody one of these days that would. Because I tell you, the toughest thing in the church is when there's a division. And the church hurts, the community hurts, the witness, you know what I'm saying. Then they love those that they teach. They love those that they teach. You know, I think the only thing that's a vital requirement outside of being saved to teach kids is that you at least like them. You know? And I know some people just, they don't like kids. They have a problem with kids. Fortunately, I'm not one of those people. Hopefully, you're not one of those people. If you get anything out of tonight, it is to go home and ask God to help you love the kids. If you thought about the fact that the only thing we have to offer a lost and dying world they cannot get somewhere else is the love of Jesus. You think about it. We can't compete with the world in entertainment. Man, they'll beat us to death. Yep. And we can't do huge giveaways every week and that kind of thing. Besides, if somebody can give somebody something to come to church, somebody can give them something not to. Yeah, that's right. But there's one thing they can get here that they can't get anywhere else, and that's the love of Jesus. And if churches ever get a handle on what that means, and we love people like God wants us to love people, we won't have any trouble with church growth. They'll be knocking the doors down. Because people want somebody to love them and care about them and be genuine about it. And people spend a lot of time and a lot of money and commit a lot of sin trying to find somebody that loves them just a little bit and get some of that acceptance. And so love them. The people that you teach, love them. And if you're not in love with them, find something else to do, because you're creating more problems than you're solving. Then they are in charge of their self. They are in charge of their self. They're self-starters. They're self-motivated. They're self-controlled. And self-disciplined. I'll go over them again with you. Self-starters, self-motivated, self-controlled, and self-disciplined. And boy, those 4 words contain a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, if you can master all of those things, you're doing really well. Self-starters, self-motivated, self-controlled, and self-disciplined. One of the things that I'm glad about is that my mother taught first grade for, gosh, I don't know how long. She did it for 30, 40 years, and much of the stuff I'm going to share with you tomorrow came out of the fact she did. And one of the best things that I remember, she passed when she was, gosh, I forgot how old she is, but she died in 2001. And I got to go back to Flint River Baptist Church, my home church in Huntsville, Alabama, and watch her as Sunday school was getting started, and all of the people that came by to say hello to her. And boy, you talk about a blessing, all the way from second graders up to adults that she had taught through the years. And I guess there was 14 or 15 that came by that morning and gave her a hug and all that kind of thing. It was interesting to watch teenage boys come in and say, hello, Miss Hips, and give her a hug. And when she died, they put up a plaque in her class, outside the door, the Clara Hips Memorial Sunday School class, and it's still over there. But she had all of these qualities, and I don't think I'm being a little starry-eyed with my mom. I think she was all that. We got to church an hour early because Sunday school teachers were supposed to get to church early. Now, this wasn't a good thing for my brother and I, because we were both kids running around in the church for an hour before anybody got there. And we got a lot of whippings on Sunday morning when my mother found out where we were. But she was that way because she was a self-starter. You didn't have to worry whether, if she wasn't there, something bad had happened. And she drug us a lot of times when we were sick, and we sat in the corner of her class and we'd throw up or whatever in the garbage can, but we were going to church. Now, that would probably be child cruelty today, but that was just the way it was, because that was important to her. And then she was self-motivated. She made sure that she had a good lesson put together. The add-on things we're going to talk about tomorrow came from her, and it's a great way to enhance your lessons that we're going to talk about. She was self-controlled because she never killed me or my brother. My sister wasn't too bad, but I realize now what self-control that took. Now that I had kids and got grandkids. My grandkids are okay, my other kids are okay. They're so-so, my regular kids. And then she was self-disciplined. She really worked to make sure that and I have problems in some areas with that. I tend to overeat, but I figured God wanted us to, or He wouldn't have made food so good. You know, you can rationalize anything almost. And besides, gluttony is the one sin Baptists allow. We don't put up with much else, but we build programs around. You know, whenever we get together, we're going to eat something. We're going to do that tonight, by the way. So anyway, then they're growing spiritually. They're growing spiritually. That goes along with your walk with God. And it's a constant thing to grow spiritually. I tell you, I wished I could say it was easy, but it's not. Everybody, I think, has some area that they have to fight to grow spiritually. There's something that they either don't like praying, they don't like reading the Bible, they get bored in church, but there's something they have to fight. And we have to be growing spiritually if we're going to be effective as teachers. Then they are servant leaders. They are servant leaders. I was at Broadway Baptist here in Memphis for 8 years when it was down on Shelby Drive, and had a huge bus ministry. We ran about 600 every Sunday on buses, and we had a lot of Mid-American students that came down because we got the school here. And I remember we were setting up chairs for children's church, and one of the guys in there was a Mid-American student, and I said, hey, what I call it, his name is, you gonna give us a hand? He said, well, God didn't call me to set up chairs. And I said, well, what did God call you to do? And he said, well, God called me to preach. And I said, well, man, you're going to have a tough time. And he didn't like it. He got mad and left. Never did get a church. Because before pastors out here today setting up chairs. I was setting up all my stuff. Now, he could have called somebody and said, I'm the pastor, I don't set up chairs. But it's a lot better just to set up a chair because they needed to be set up. And a servant leader has that kind of attitude in heart. In fact, I was telling him when we go to seminary, they ought to teach us how to move tables and set up chairs. That's what a big part of the ministry is. It's doing what needs to be done. And if you're too big to do anything, then you're not a servant. You know, Jesus was washing feet, and he wasn't doing it because feet was dirty. He was doing it because people needed a lesson. And I tell you, that foot washing thing, just to throw something in, if you've ever done that, that is a humbling thing. I didn't mind washing somebody else's feet. We did it in our church one time, and I know some churches it's an ordinance, but when I allowed somebody else to wash my feet, boy, that is tough. That is tough, boy. And anyway, the whole idea is that to be a leader, you have to be a servant. And to be a servant, it means you do those things that aren't necessarily too glamorous. That's just the way it is. Then they feel teaching is God's place for them. They feel teaching is God's place for them. If you're here and you've been struggling with the fact that maybe you're not teaching, you don't like teaching, you'd rather be doing something else than teaching, but you're doing it because they need somebody to do it, you really ought to go talk to somebody and say, this is not for me. Because it's not helping you, and it's not helping the kids. I mean, it's tough enough when you really enjoy this to hang in there doing it. But if you don't enjoy it, if it's not where God's called you to do, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, pastors and other folks in the church, sometimes we act like it is, because if you quit, we're going to have to get somebody else to take your place. And so we'd rather have somebody lousy doing it than us have to find somebody else to do it. And that's just me. I know your people never like that, but that's the way I was. So the deal is, if you don't enjoy it and you don't feel like it's where God wants you to be, you need to find out where that place is that God does want you to be and where you feel like you fit in and that sort of thing. Then they are in it for the long run. They are in it for the long run. I don't think you ought to quit doing anything you're doing unless God says it's okay. We had a guy that drove one of our buses, and he'd been driving for 7 or 8 years, and he came to me one Sunday morning and said, hey, when is vacation Bible school going to be over? Now, this was January. And I said, what in the world do you mean? He said, well, y'all told me that I just had to drive this bus till Bible school was over. And that's been 7 years ago. And I said, that's okay, Alan, we'll tell you. Bible school's over, we'll tell you. But he was one of those guys that did it for that week, and he ended up deciding this wasn't so bad. And it just became his place for God to have. And when you're where God wants you to be, it's a whole lot more fun. And you're going to stick out a whole lot longer than if somebody talked you into doing it. So they are in it for the long run. They reproduce themselves. Boy, this is probably an area that you have trouble with. But part of the deal of being a leader of any kind is the fact that you reproduce yourself. One of the hardest things for Sunday school teachers to do, especially adult Sunday school teachers, is to allow somebody in their class to go somewhere and teach their own class, because they hate losing those people in their class. But that's the whole purpose, is to get people to the place where they can start doing service now. It's not just come and sit and enjoy and soak up and all that kind of stuff. Our job is to reproduce ourselves, and so we want to do that every chance that we get. And sometimes it's going to happen with those little kids that we minister to. We don't see it, but because of you, some of them are thinking, I believe I could do that. Now, they're 10 years old, but somewhere in the back of their head, that's been planted because of the fact that you're there every morning and every Sunday morning, and because of the fact that you make a difference in their life. Then they make themselves available. They make themselves available. You got folks in your church that when something needs to be done, man, they're the ones that say, okay, I'll do that or whatever. Now, sometimes that's not so good. But the key is the fact they're willing to be there if you need somebody to help. Sometimes they do too much. But we ought to be the same way. Because you got a group of folks in your church that aren't going to do anything. They're not available to do nothing. And that's the way they like it. In fact, if your church is like most churches, you got 10% of the folks who are willing to work and 90% of the folks are willing to level. That's just the way it is. And it doesn't matter what size church you're in. I served in the church 3 years, and I'll tell you this whole story tomorrow, that ran less than 100, and that was not, we had about 10 people in that church that did everything. Now I'm back in church that I came from, Sagemont. They run about 4,000. They got about 400 that do everything. Now the difference is 400 is a lot more than 10, so you got a lot bigger pool to clip, but the percentage is the same. You, as a leader, as a teacher, make yourself available when there's a need. And that doesn't mean you volunteer for everything, but it means that if God gives you that prompt and you say, okay, I'm here, then they are prepared. They are prepared. Either you're going to have a program or they're going to have a program. It's better for you to have one. And that means you have to be prepared. I wish I could say, I figured out a way that you don't have to do anything and you can be a great children's teacher. But there's no such animal. It is harder to me to prepare for kids than it is to prepare for adults. Adults are easy. You don't know if they're listening or not. They look like they're listening. But you don't know that. You know, they're sitting there taking notes and they're filling in all the O's in the bulletin, you know. But you look at them, and kids, you know pretty quick whether they're listening or not. And you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared. You have now, those of you that have been doing it a long time, it doesn't take you near as long to prepare as it does for somebody just getting started. Some of you have been doing it long enough. They could call you and say, could you come over here and teach this class? And you could come up with something because you've had that practice. But all of us, if we're going to stay fresh and we're going to be effective, we've got to prepare. And that means sometimes during the week, we got to do some planning. And that's just the way it is. Then they are flexible. They are flexible. My children's ministry motto for years has been to count on everything going wrong, and if something goes right, work it in. Because that way I'm ready for anything that happens. You know, everything's going to go wrong, and I'm going to not worry about it. Now, some mornings it feels that way. You know, sometimes on Wednesday night, you know, the kids are crazy, and it just seems like nothing you do works. But you're flexible. You just say, okay, that's the way it is tonight. We'll do better next week. But you're just flexible. And they're always trying to improve. They're always trying to improve. I never go anywhere that I don't come away with at least one idea. No. And because there's something that's going to come up that I'm going to say, boy, I never thought of that. You know, and that's the way we all ought to be. When I go to church and I preach on Sunday morning, and I did something all day Saturday, and somebody comes up and says, well, you know, I teach in the 6th grade or whatever, but I didn't come yesterday because I know all that stuff. And I want to say, no, you don't. You don't know how dumb you are. Because everybody can learn. Yeah. If nothing else, you get reinforced for what you're already doing. Yeah. And so there's always room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. Now, any of these things you want to talk about before we finish up with these other things that are listed down there? Any of them that you have a particular interest in? Any of these that you have a story about? Any of these that you didn't understand what in the world I was talking about? Any of these that you want to straighten somebody else on? Now, if you don't have anything, that's fine. But if you do,
I can certainly identify with the behind-the-scenes ministries, the backstage stuff. Because when I was going to church up in Maine, I was what everybody referred to as the most invisible usher. I